Hello, and welcome to the Gallimaufry, a hodgepodge history podcast. Thank you for joining us again. My name is Will, and I am joined here remotely by my good friend Nick. How are you doing today, Nick?
I'm good. Yes,
Yeah.
I won't
What's going
regale
on?
the listeners with the story I told you prior to
No.
you record about how I managed to get some money off a bed.
Yeah, that highlight of the week there for a man in his 30s.
Yeah. My bed has been broken for a while, although not for exciting reasons.
Okay, no more questions. I'm glad to hear that you're making full use of your time.
What about you? Have you been up to much?
Not breaking beds, no. Just ploughing away, doing the thing. Anyway, shall we go into what we're talking about in this episode?
Yes, we will. And just to point out, because it's been pointed out to me, because I didn't realise it, this is actually going to be another topic with a focus on British history. We've done quite a few in a row now.
We should probably rename ourselves, should we?
No. I think we just accidentally fell down that hole, but we will be branching out, and we will hopefully deliver you a thumping good show, which will leave a thorough stamp of enjoyment.
Without further ado, let us begin.
Yes, we're going to be talking about the Postal Service, and sadly, I don't mean seminal noughties electronic super duo Ben Gibbard and Jimmy Tamborello.
Oh, okay. Right. I might need to do a bit of last minute research then.
Okay. I mean the actual UK Postal Service, otherwise known as the Royal Mail. And now we've all had that feeling of waiting for the post to arrive, the excitement, the anticipation, the eventual disappointment. But, where did it all begin? Why is it called the Royal Mail? How long have we been using post systems? I mean, how many times has the Queen's head been licked? I mean, these are all vital questions that we just hope to answer.
Yeah, they're questions I never knew I wanted to know the answer to.
But yeah, every great civilization has had some form of messaging service over its, lifetime. After all, communication was key to informing different parts of your empire of impending invasions, food deliveries, and of course, but most importantly, taxes.
What would life be without taxes?
Much less taxing, I would say.
It's thought that the practice of written documents being transported from one person to another by a third party actually dates back to the invention of writing. The earliest known example that we know of an organised courier service dates back to about 2400 BCE in ancient Egypt. The first regular postal service actually has its origins in ancient Persia. One claim lies with Cyrus the Great, who ruled Persia in the mid-500s BCE. Not only did Cyrus mandate that a postal service be provided in all of his provinces, but he also arranged for the same to be done in neighbouring countries. Cyrus's Persian postal system operated in a similar fashion to the later American Pony Express, where a messenger would ride from one post on a route to the next, at which point another messenger would take the letter and carry it on to the next post.
It's a bit like one of those relay races you see in the Olympics. Is that where they come from, relay events? Do you reckon someone thought,
the baton.
Well, yeah, just these important questions we're asking and not providing any answers to.
I know. But yeah, going back to the Persians, like the Egyptians before, the service was, however, restricted only to those deemed important enough. The concept of a postal service was adopted by various civilizations over the centuries, evolving over time to become more efficient, affordable, and most importantly, open to the general public.
Yes. So what about the average Joe and Jane? When did public mail become a thing rather than the preservation of the ruling and military classes? Well,
is that a rhetorical question?
No, you're right to ask, because it's not rhetorical. Throughout the Middle Ages, there were loads of different private individuals who used local services to send messages, but these were often threadbare because the most people that could actually read and write were often rich or from the elite, the nobility, etc. But thanks to our old friend the printing press, check out episode 11, hey, literacy and writing became way more common. You had national systems being set up alongside small local systems, and one of the largest systems built was by Thurn and Taxis, who originally came from Bergamo in Milan, which is in Italy. Under the patronage of the Habsburg emperors, they became the organisers of an extensive network linking all the imperial connections they had. And this developed throughout the 16th century until it covered most of Europe, and it's actually more or less the basis of many European postal systems today. However, if we take it back to the first real public mail systems, we as the English like to claim we're like the first in many, many things, when really we just take an idea and then say it's we thought it up.
It's the British way.
It is the British way. Both the French and the English set up mail systems in the 15th and 16th centuries respectively, largely not for public use, but they would then develop into them. But the French kind of got there first. The basis of a real public service wasn't created until 1627 in France, when fees and timetables were fixed and post offices established in larger cities. Britain, it came in 1635. But let's just take a little wind back. Specifically February 1512, Henry VIII created basically the postal system under Sir Brian Tuke, although the official title of postmaster wouldn't actually come to a bit later. Henry just got sick of hiring individual couriers to carry messages from him. And Tuke must have done a good job, because a few years later in 1516 he was knighted. It was that he was doing a good job, or he was maybe reading all the saucy letters Henry sent and got a bit of dirt on him.
He had a track record. That man definitely sent some very saucy letters.
He definitely did.
I remember on a visit to Hampton Court once reading about, there's actually records of his love letters that he was sending to one of his wives. I can't remember which one. And they they come across as like this slightly seedy ramblings of a teenage boy.
Well, back then you didn't have mobile phones. You couldn't send a dick pic. So he would send saucy letters.
They were just sort of endearingly crap.
Well, he'd already married them, so they can't escape.
Yeah, he did.
Those poor women.
If you believe legend, he did write the song "Greensleeves," didn't he? It's a love song.
Yeah, but it's crap.
I mean, in its day, it was a banger, though, wasn't it? Greensleeves.
Because there's no other songs, just Greensleeves.
If there were now, that's what I call music. 1612. Then
be one song, and maybe a remix by a local bard. I don't know.
Yeah, you'd have to have the
David Guetta's Greensleeves.
Oh yeah, that would be a banger, wouldn't it?
Anyway, coming back to the post service. This post service was, of course, just for Henry. Like most of the other postal systems we've talked about, they were for the preserve of the elite. But in 1635, Charles I, famous for losing his head, kicked off the Royal Mail Service on the 31st of July, appointing Thomas Withering's Postmaster of Foreign Mails. And this system saw London connect as far as Edinburgh. And on it, there were 6 main post roads throughout the country. And the very first post office was set up in Bishopsgate Street in London. And it was a bit of a strange system, because there were 4 main post roads that ran between London, Dover, Plymouth and Edinburgh. And then they later added Bristol and Yarmouth. But if you sent a letter from Yarmouth to Edinburgh, it would still have to travel through London. So it's a bit of a weird system. However, letters tended to travel like basically 24/7 because they had no concept of workers' rights. But, who were these brave souls giving this long, difficult, incredibly important task? Can you guess? That's right, it's children, of course.
Oh, right. Lovely.
And my God, it was hard work. Although I'm being a bit unfair. There were men employed as well, but the youngest could be 11 years old. And they're basically given a bag of, important documents slung on their back and said, off you pop. So yes, they travelled usually on foot, or sometimes, if they were lucky, horseback. And of course, were they rewarded for their hard work? No, they were paid bugger all. Thankfully, though, over time, the system that the Persians had employed like hundreds and hundreds of years ago, effectively, they finally figured that out in medieval times that could actually work for them as well. So it eventually became a relay race in the same manner that the Persians used to do it, where postboys would travel up to about 20 miles, then pass the letter or package on to the next person.
So things hit a bit of a speed bump when the Civil War came along, as most things did at the time. However, luckily, Cromwell, being the victor of that one, saw the advantages of the postal system after nicking Charles's job and decided to keep it. The Royal Mail was put under direct government control, overseen by a man called John Thurlow, who was Oliver Cromwell's notorious spymaster general. While letters between suspected conspirators had previously been blocked, Thurlow opted to instead read the letters in transit before delivering them to the intended recipient. He would then pass off any juicy gossip to his mate Cromwell.
Well, I'd assume that recipient would also get some nice torturing.
Oh yeah, probably.
Yeah, nice stay in the tower.
Yeah, but the Second Protectorate government, which was Cromwell's government that he formed, eventually expanded the service to the entire Commonwealth, with the first Postmaster General being appointed in 1661. This was also when the first seal appeared on the mail. After the Restoration in 1660, all statute passed by the Cromwell Parliament was chucked out, and a general post office was established by the new King Charles II.
Yeah, so Thurlow was basically kicked out with the Restoration, and he was replaced by Henry Bishop, who was actually formerly a supporter of Charles I, who returned with the Restoration. He'd actually spent the last couple of years in Virginia sort of sitting it out, although he was actually on good terms with Parliament when he returned as well. The Post Office Act, which was created in this year, formally established a publicly owned postal service rather than simply being a private service open to public use. It's a state-sponsored, state-run thing. And of course, what happened when he took over? Bishop was immediately met with complaints about delivery timings. Presumably because Thurlow spent all his time, opening the mail, reading it, and then arresting people rather than actually delivering them. He introduced the world's first postmark, which had, effectively, it's that sort of black ink stamp that you get over the actual stamp, which gives you the date and the location of the sorting office.
Ah, right.
And he did this because he just got sick of people saying, "Where's my letter? It's late." And he said, well, this will tell us when your letter arrived at the office, so if it's late, beat your local postboy because he's delivered it late.
It's not a perfect scheme, though, is it? Because you could put any date you like on it when you stamp it.
Exactly. It's the beauty of it.
Yeah.
Just stamp it like 2 days before it actually arrives. And it's like, yeah, it's not my fault, mate. It's the boys.
Oh, genius. Anyway, so things trundled along as they were for a bit. And then 1680, two men called William Dockwra and Robert Murray established the London Penny Post, which provided a service whereby mail could be delivered within London and its immediate suburbs for 1 penny. The London Penny Post was the first service to use hand stamps to postmark the mail, indicating the place and time of its posting and confirming that postage had been paid. This is generally believed to have been the world's first postage stamp, though not quite as we know it today. The success of the London Penny Post was so great that the government actually came to see it as a threat to the General Post Office's monopoly, leading to its takeover a few years later, and it becoming a branch of the GPO.
Essentially, the Penny Post was a private service competing with the new state. Well, I say new. By now, it had been about 2 decades. Dockwra was actually found guilty of infringement in a judgment that found in favour of the Duke of York, who was supposed to be the recipient of all the revenue of the post office in that area. So it was absorbed, basically. It was kind of a bit like a mafia family coming in and saying, well, lovely operation you've got here, we'll be taking over from now on. So he kind of got dicked over.
So while this was a bit crap for Dockwra, a few years later in 1688, when James II had been removed from power, his replacements decided to at least grant him a pension of £500 a year for his efforts.
So the Royal Mail kept expanding, kept growing, and by 1784, it was effectively known as the Royal Mail across the country, having been, referred to as a parcel service or a package service or post service, whatever you want to be. Royal Mail became the standardised name. And this was partly in thanks to the creation of the stagecoach service in 1782, formulated by theatre owner John Palmer, who got the idea of transporting packages and in a sort of a big carriage after he used them to sort of whisk his axe between his theatres that he owned in Bath and Bristol. When you think of a big sort of traditional carriage, that's what they look like. Big red things with livery all over them. They were manned by an armed guard rather than a defenceless little boy, so that was a bit of a step up. It's very hard for like an 11-year-old to hold a big blunderbuss. It's just difficult. William Pitt gave approval for a trial for them in 1784 between Bristol and London, and they were massively successful. The current record was a day without a coach. With the coach, it went down to 16 hours. And they used to carry around little horns with them that they would blow when they approached a gate, which basically signalled, "Get the hell out of the way, we're a post service, open the gate." And they couldn't really stop. They could take passengers actually with them, and charge them a fee for travelling with them. But if the passenger got off, they wouldn't wait for them.
Oh, okay.
So there are a few stories of couples travelling, and like one gets out to use the facilities, and then the coach has already left. So they're just like stuck somewhere. For his efforts, Palmer was actually later appointed comptroller of the post office in 1786.
I bet as a man who ran theatres, he was really pleased to suddenly find himself as a sort of civil servant.
So the guards themselves are quite interesting. They wore a scarlet red coat, which had blue lapels, gold braid, and a nice proper black hat. So they looked respectable. You had to look respectable if you were a Royal Mail postman, basically. The coaches themselves were weirdly not owned by the Royal Mail. They were privately hired.
When did their little shorts come in?
I think that's more of a US thing.
No, our UK postmen, they wear little shorts.
I don't know. Doesn't feel very.
Asking the important questions here. When did the little shorts come in?
I'm afraid I can't answer that.
Oh no.
No, actually, I refuse to answer that.
What about the trolleys that they carry the parcels in?
Oh, you mean those big plasticky things?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think those are recent. They always tie them to like lampposts with like the weakest amount of lock.
They do, yeah. I think they're kind of hoping someone steals it so they can go home. By 1792, there were 16 coaches that left Lombard Street in London daily, with as many inbound. In addition, there were 15 cross-country mail coaches delivering post around the country. But by 1811, there were some 211. Moses Nobbs... Stop sniggering.
It's a great name.
Moses Nobbs was the most famous guard, even appearing on cigarette cards, having served for 55 years, retiring at the age of 71 in 1891. This service ran until 1846, when the railways finally killed it off, and some of the guards jumped over to the trains, including old Moses.
If anyone's interested, there's a free book you can find on the internet just by Googling Moses Nobbs. Just be careful with this surname. It interviews him and it details his life story. And he describes some pretty horrific accidents he witnessed on a pretty regular basis. But one of the interesting things was, like, we all think of like carriages as being held up by highwaymen constantly. In his 55 years of service, he only got attacked once, and that was basically when he started. And then he just fired a shot into the air and they ran away.
You don't mess with Moses Nobbs.
No, you don't. You really don't.
No. But mail was actually also sent by boats, which were called packets, with a permanent transatlantic service established in 1763. If you thought the land ones were in for a rough time, at least you couldn't drown. The elements were a lot more unkind to those in the water, in addition to pirates and numerous European wars that plagued delivery. Gradually, the network expanded across the country, utilising new technology and far-off destinations. It wasn't until the year Victoria ascended the throne that waves of change were to come.
Yes, so, and as we all know, Victoria ascended to the throne in 1837, that remarkable year. Her first year on the throne, which had nothing to do with her, just a lot of things seemed to happen in Victoria's reign because she reigned for so long, but she just had, more or less had no bearing on them. But yeah, her first year on the throne saw the postal system completely transformed and overhauled into more or less the system we sort of recognise today. So previously, if you sent a letter, you as the receiver had to pay for it. A bit like placing a collect call. So imagine that. You get a letter and it could be anything. It could be like if you get a random letter from, I don't know, someone you don't like and they call you an arsehole in it, you've had to pay for that.
So you'd have to pay to receive your gas bill.
I mean, for full disclosure, they didn't have gas in 1837, but you'd have to pay for things.
I mean, if you really had it in for someone, could you just post them like War and Peace, page by page?
You, sir, are a genius. I love that. The cost of sending a letter was really expensive, so just one single page could cost 12 loaves of bread, which put it a bit out of reach of the everyday person because that's quite a lot of hovers to get through. So letters were charged based on pages and distance. So enter Rowland Hill. He was a teacher, a reformer, and an inventor. As most Victorians, they had multiple jobs, a bit like our parliamentarians today, although less contributing to society and more to their own wealth. And he was from Kidderminster, and he saw the system needed massive reform. And he argued that by making it cheaper and easier to use, more people would use the system, thus increasing profits. And the most major reform he introduced was, of course, Will?
Stamps. I mean, you couldn't really talk about Royal Mail without talking about stamps, could you? By the mid-19th century, the post office was suffering from a series of steady financial losses, and seeking to steady the ship, a number of reforms were proposed, one of which was the introduction of a flat rate for letters sent anywhere within the country. In 1840, 2 new stamps were introduced to the public: the penny black for items of up to half an ounce in weight, and the 2 penny blue for items of up to 1 ounce. Unlike previous stamps, the new ones would be sold directly to the public, who would then attach it to the letter themselves as proof of payment. To encourage their uptake, any letters with insufficient postage or prepaid at the post office would be subject to double postage when delivered.
That's right. So, in just a space of a few short years, it completely turned the mail system on its head. So it went from, as we mentioned, pages and distance to weight. It went from the receiver having to pay to the sender having to pay, and introduced the stamp as proof of postage to facilitate this. Now, what I find really fascinating was that the adoption of the stamp itself came from a very British tradition of a postal competition. People wrote in to suggest how they could prepay for letters, and the winner was James Dundee, a man from Scotland, who floated the idea of a self-adhesive stamp that could then also be stamped using a postmark, as in what we mentioned earlier with the date and the time of the sorting office. Obviously, Rowland loved the idea and decided to use the image of Queen Victoria from 1838 when she just ascended the throne. And this one would actually go on to be used for the entirety of her reign, even when she was getting a bit long in the tooth and looked nothing like a stamp. 1840 saw the first penny black, and it spawned a revolution, effectively, as well as spawning philatelists everywhere.
It's a stamp collector, is it?
Yeah, there we are.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm a deltologist, which are far superior.
You collect old PCs?
No, I collect postcards.
So I don't know which is the I don't know which interests me less.
Thanks. I've not shown you my postcard collection.
No, you haven't.
I think a postcard's so much more interesting than a stamp. I mean, they only started introducing different stamps in like the 60s, but postcards, they've been around for ages.
Ooh. Near where my parents live, there's the Saucy Postcard Museum.
Go on.
Your eyes would be out on stalks if you went there. Is this you telling me you want me to send you more postcards when I go on holiday?
Well, you used to send me postcards, but they would always be specific types of postcards.
Well, I used to put it in the postbox and laugh at the idea of your postman handing it over to you. It's amazing some of those made it through.
It's amazing that you stopped. Please stop. Anyway, the black penny stamp actually itself only lasted a year, but in that year, over 68 million were printed, of which 6 million survive today in some form. Apparently, they estimate. They can't really be sure. It was replaced by the penny red in 1841. It was actually replaced because it was quite easy to sort of reuse them, and they didn't want people to reuse them.
Okay.
But this, coupled with the rise of literacy, in part thanks to the Industrial Revolution, which saw people move from the country to working jobs where they needed a bit of education and literacy, helped increase letter writing immensely. So, by I think around 1839, you had about 67 million letters sent. By 1844, it was 242 million. And by 1875, it was over 1 billion. That's a lot of ink and paper. Those poor trees. What's most interesting about this, all of it wasn't just friendly letters of business stuff. You have some of the first early phishing attempts from con men sending out letters. So, you get those I'm a Nigerian prince, I need £500 to...
Oh, yes, yeah. Was the Prince of Nigeria, was he sending letters to people in the 19th century then?
No, he wasn't. So there were a couple of different actual tricks con men used to use. Some would pretend to be like stranded expats in like Spain, which was just far enough away to be exotic and unknowable because of the ignorance of the English, much like Nigeria is today. When you think about it, no one really knows what Nigeria is like unless they've been there. Which is why it was often a common trick, because it's far enough away for you to not really know anything, but to recognise it if brought up.
I always thought with the Nigerian scam that there was a certain element of presumed racism that you were conning out.
That's the point. Like, you're like, oh wow, I get all this money for helping this this person.
What a fool! This prince. Yeah. What does he know? I'll show him.
So that's why it was Spain. That was one trick. Similar thing would be like, can you send me this money to get me out of Stuck, and I'll send you all this back, basically. And then there were actual like lodging houses across London, home to hundreds of professional begging letter writers. That's what they were called. And most of these used to be like, clerks or fallen priests or dodgy doctors, that had fallen out of favour. And thousands of these were sent daily and like all around the country to different people. And they defrauded the public of around 50 grand a year, which is about 2 million in today's terms. And in 1840, the number of begging letters doubled with the penny postage. So, it had a negative side effect. There's one famous person called Henry Perfect. He was the son of a Leicestershire clergyman who was eventually indicted for basically conning all these people. And he got money out of the Earl of Carrington, Lord Willoughby de Broke,
right.
my favourite, Lady Littleton, Lady Howard, and a bunch of different bishops and stuff. He earned himself £488, which he was sentenced to 7 years in Botany Bay.
Oh, so that really was the Nigerian prince scam of its day then.
This actually led to the establishment of the London Mendacity Society, which was a sort of vigilante group that went around trying to track down people who was writing all these letters.
So stamps carried on until really the present day, each time being updated with the present monarch's head, as we swapped one for another. 1965 actually saw the stamps overhauled by the current postmaster at the time, Tony Benn, to mark events and national symbols. Every year there are about 15 new ones issued, and the monarch has to approve all of them. Initially, the Queen, Queen Elizabeth II, objected to removing her head entirely, which is why it has always appeared in the corner, prompting Ben to ponder whether the monarch interfering with state matters was a good thing or not. Interesting note, this is breaking news, actually. Today, they actually announced the new King Charles III stamps.
I don't think it's wise to use the word today, given that I have to then cut this.
Oh.
But suffice to say, we're recording this around February, which should give you a clue.
And just the controversy is that he's not wearing his crown.
He's not wearing his crown, no.
No.
It's quite a simple silhouette. He looks quite vulnerable, actually.
The one of George the Sixth, it actually looks like he's just had a surprise.
Stamps are, I was mocking philatelists earlier, but they're quite interesting.
They're boring, but they sort of represent points in history. You see the monarch and after he sort of bends reforms, commemorating important events and people of the time.
Yeah, I guess. I also like the idea of him and his designer going to the Queen. Here's some ideas for stamps, and she's like, "Where am I? I'm not on these stamps." That's a little exchange I imagine in my head, anyway.
I think it was more like, "Oi, what you playing at, Ben?
Get out of my palace, sling your hook." Just before we touch on another important aspect of the postal system, and one which is also very iconic, Roland would also go on to have a number of other achievements. He would go on to solve the growing problem of postal confusion in London by sorting it into districts. But he basically drew a 12-mile radius around central London, divided it into 10 in 1857, which essentially meant you now had local sorting offices who could now more easily sort and deliver mail across the different districts. And this system would last well into the 20th century, and it would be replicated in other cities across the UK. And just one other innovation of his, because the man was a genius apparently, was to open the first sort of public savings bank in 1861. So I don't know if we still have it. I always remember my gran talking about, we're just going to go and get my savings from the post office. It basically just meant ordinary folk could give their money. It was secured by the government, and you could earn a bit in terms of interest. So by 1866, little over like 5 years after opening, 600,000 people had signed up, and it was worth a total of 8.2 million.
I think, from what I remember, it eventually got wound up and sold off to Alliance and Leicester.
The post office has always had this, I guess not so much anymore, which is kind of sad, but it was like the centre of a lot of communities.
It makes a lot of sense. It's a state-owned shopfront, essentially, and there's one in every town. It made a lot of sense for that to be sort of the centre of how, people's lives are administered, how they can do things like savings and sending letters and applying for driving licenses, all that sort of thing.
But it also shows that how important communication is. But of course, one of the major innovations to enable better communication was, of course, the postbox.
So as delivery became faster, people installed holes in their doors for the letters to be popped through without them even having to open it. It was quite a wild time. And then it got even wilder. It was another creative that solved the issue of the long post office queue, and that was Anthony Trollope. We're just full of funny surnames in this episode, aren't we?
Have you never read Anthony Trollope?
I have not. What did he write?
Chronicles of Barsetshire, I think.
I've never read it. Like something I would read, but I'm sure it's great. Yeah. So Anthony Trollope, author of Chronicles of Barsetshire. He was also a surveyor's clerk, and he proposed the concept of the postal box to solve the issue of making people have to travel to the post office to post their letters. In September of 1853, Carlisle got the first ever postbox in Britain after they trialled them on the Channel Islands in the year before. The first postbox was a hexagonal pillar painted green and with the monarch's cipher. Red became the universal colour in 1874, as green was a bit dreary in the countryside. It's probably also kind of inadvertently camouflaged if you put it next to a bush as well.
Yeah, it's quite difficult to spot.
Yeah. There have been quite a few iterations since, including the wall box, which was used in rural areas as it was cheaper.
That's that sort of flat iron box you see sort of lodged into some post offices. So rather than have it as a separate thing.
But the last design commissioned was the cigar box, which fell out of use in 2000 after running from 1980. Postboxes are funny that you sort of ignore them because they're part of the street furniture, but when you actually look at them, there's a lot of different styles out there. I live near a very rare postbox. My one says Edward VIII on it. The one who handed in his notice after, what was it, a few months?
Yeah, he fell in love with Wallace Simpson.
Yeah, that was the one.
He was an American.
He was on the throne just long enough for them to make a few post boxes with his name on, and one of them landed up near me. Yeah, so the boxes which were most familiar is the classic Victorian Type 8, which was developed in 1879.
We actually have one of those where I live in Streatham with the original VR cipher. But ciphers themselves are interesting. They're kind of there to denote it as an official postbox, but also give it a sort of construction date. And a cipher, as you said, is like just they're sort of the monarch's initials. Yeah,
I mean, also on slightly less breaking news, I think they announced Charles III's cipher a couple of months ago, didn't they? And it's very simple compared to his predecessors.
I guess what he's always talked about being a streamlined monarch, and I guess from, as we mentioned, the stamp earlier, it's quite a laid back, quite simplistic thing. So I think that's just his style. He's cheap, cheerful, or rather not cheerful. He looks quite miserable in the stamp actually. Cheap. Looks cheap.
Cheap and miserable. I like it.
Cheap and miserable.
Yeah, there's a monarch I can get behind. Cheap and miserable. But the oldest postbox is actually from 1853. It's the original design, and it's located at Barnes Cross in Holwell, near Sherborne in Dorset. Blue airmail postboxes were introduced in 1930, with the service having begun in 1919. You don't see many blue post boxes anymore.
Transporting packages itself, though, that's obviously a key part of the Royal Mail. So long before Jeff Bezos and his army of Amazon postal delivery workers, there was parcel post, conceived in 1883 in conjunction with the railways, which had obviously been growing in power and were just better than sending a carriage around the country. So they sort of brokered a deal with the train companies to sort of transport packages across the country. This meant a substantial change for the post office because now they suddenly had a lot more volume and they were delivering a lot bigger items. So it meant they needed to redesign post offices, establish sorting centres, and introduce weighing scales in all their offices. And this covered more than 15,000 districts. The increase in weight, of course, of the sacks themselves also led to some of the first sort of union-y action, because it introduced the minimum wage of 18 shillings a week for post office workers after they basically demanded higher pay, saying, my back hurts, this is too heavy. This is also actually the first time they became referred to as postmen. Puberty after all these years had finally struck. So trains had actually been carrying mail from way before this in the 1830s. But, we still used other methods of transport, or rather they still used. It was the trusty horse, which lasted well into the 20th century. Bikes started being trialled in the 1880s, but they didn't really take off until the 20th century. So by about 1933, you had about 200 million miles a year travelled by post office bike until they were sort of phased out a little later. But yeah, there's so many different forms of travel. You have motorbikes and cars that came along in the 20th century as well, and other exciting innovations, which I believe you're going to talk to us about.
Yeah, so the Postal Service also helped to build new infrastructure and communication across Britain. So in 1912, it opened a national telephone service. In 1919, it developed the first international airmail service, developed by the Royal Engineers and the Royal Air Force. And the London Post Office Railway was opened in 1927. So the London Post Office Railway, otherwise known as Mail Rail, was open and operational from 1927 until 2003. It operated 22 hours a day for 286 days a year and carried around 4 million letters a day. It ran from Paddington to Mount Pleasant It ran from Paddington to Mount Pleasant to the Eastern District Office near Whitechapel. It sadly closed in 2003 due to running costs, as road and rail mail was quicker and cheaper. I believe you can still ride on it there, can't you? Oh, and by the way, it's also entirely underground.
Yes, I've actually had the pleasure of riding on the rail mail.
Oh, do tell.
I say pleasure, you kind of feel like a package. Sort of crammed into this. They haven't adjusted the train size, obviously, because the tunnels are quite narrow, so you just sort of crammed into this little
It sounds like a
tube train.
claustrophobic nightmare.
Yeah, I wouldn't go in it if you are claustrophobic. But it is interesting because they take you through this sort of narrative journey where you stop at some of the stations and then a couple of monotone postal workers start telling you about their past.
I don't know about you, but as a kid, getting post was always quite exciting.
Yeah, but when you become an adult, it's all
No,
bills.
that becomes less exciting. But as a kid, I used to send off for those free samples in the post, and we get all kinds of crap.
Free
You get
samples of what?
the free dosing ball from the back of the Persil packet or something.
I have no idea what that is. Dosing.
No, you put you pour your washing detergent into it and you put it in the drum.
No, I use. They're probably very environmentally bad. I use the tabs. I just chuck it in the washing machine.
Use a tap like a heathen. Moving on though, in 1907, the first motor vehicle entered the postal service. The 2.5-ton lorry covered 300,000 miles in its 18 years of service, and we never really looked back, as motorised vehicles have become the standard form of transport for moving the mail around the country. As seen in Postman Pat, he was always in his van, wasn't he? He was
polluting the countryside with his partner in crime, Jess. Just one interesting thing to know about the mail rail. It's actually kind of mothballed. They've not closed it down completely. because there's a possibility they might end up using it again. And the reason they closed it down because it was cheaper to use vans on the road, even though everyone said at the time, if you close this down, you're just going to add to the traffic. And Royal Mail was like, I don't care. It's cheaper.
You'd be quite good for a Deliveroo.
One thing I want to talk about is actually, we talked a lot about men and boys. And obviously
Yes,
we as with that sort of casual sexism, or ingrained sexism rather, we tend to talk about men being in the positions of roles. But women in the post office have been a vital part of it for centuries. Since the 1870s, women have worked in the offices as sub-postmistresses, clerks and telegraphists. Obviously, telegraphs appeared around the 1830s and became something of a hit. By 1900, more were sent from within Britain than any other country. And women were a vital part of making this all come together and work. There's actually one post woman called Elizabeth Dixon who retired in 1908. And over the course of her career, clocked up just under 130,000 miles.
She must have had good legs.
She had, like a cart horse. In 1901, you had the Association of Post Office Women Clerks founded. It's the first association in the UK civil service to actually represent female clerical workers in any form. So there's a bit ahead of their curve there. However, married women were barred from serving in the post office. So if you got married, you lose your job. This happened in 1876, with the ban temporarily lifted in 1914 because of the war effort and all the men were sent off to die. So obviously women were expected to pick up the slack. Interestingly enough, telegrams became the preferred way, became the only way really of informing families of soldiers' deaths due to the speed of them. So these kind of got the association attached to them of being bad news. So if you got a telegram, it's like, oh Christ, who's died?
It's like a phone call in the middle of the night.
Yeah.
You're like, oh no, something bad's happened.
Whereas a letter, a nice lovely letter, that's fine. That can't harm me, apart from a paper cut. To counteract this, in 1935, they introduced greetings telegrams. In fact, one of the first was the King mailing a happy birthday to the Postmaster General to mark the birthday of the post office. And the last telegram, I believe, was sent in 1982, which is incredible.
That is, yeah, relatively recent, isn't it?
Anyway, just coming back to women, once the war ended, things basically returned to normal in the interwar years. Married women still weren't allowed to serve in the post office. They still had their opportunities limited. But thankfully, I'd say thankfully, then came the Second World War, where women were once again asked to do their part, initially basically for free. They actually had a sweetheart appeal which encouraged them to help out their partners in the office by volunteering. So in 1914 you had over 4,000 women applying to volunteer. By 1841 over 100,000 women were employed. And after the war, in 1946, finally the marriage bar was lifted and women could, actually have jobs and families.
So moving on from that, the next major innovation was the introduction of postcodes, which were introduced in a trial in Norwich. They were rolled out nationally from 1965 to 1974, giving a postcode to every British address. Postcodes allow mail to be sorted automatically by machine. A combination of letters and numbers allows for over 48 million unique combinations, making it one of the most precise postcode systems in the world. They were based on Rowland's innovation of districts, which by 1930 were in operation across 10 major UK cities. These were based on city name followed by a number, e.g. in London in 1856, WC stood for Western Central. The reason we don't have S or any postcodes is because of Anthony Trollope, who in 1866 merged NE with E and split S into SE and SW.
Makes perfect sense.
Yeah, why not?
Makes no sense to me. I mean, today postcodes make perfect sense, but the way we name them doesn't make sense in London. But yes, today there are 1.8 million postcodes in the country. These cover more than 30 million individual addresses across 124 areas, split into 2,979 districts, 11,232 sectors, and then the 1.8 million units. So, quite the mathematical feat. Interesting enough, do you know what the smallest postcode in the country is that covers just 1 square mile?
I assume it's going to be something really obvious.
It's WC in London.
WC. Is it just really tightly packed in? There's a lot there.
It's really tightly packed in, and it's rich people.
Yeah.
I don't know why it's so small. It's just how things were carved up. It's one of those historic postcodes as well. But the largest is Inverness, which covers 6,243 square miles.
All right, that postman must be tired.
Well, I'd imagine it's quite a lot of countryside. However, despite this incredible, helpful new invention, which would make post workers' lives so much easier, people still ignored them at first. They just didn't write them onto letters. So they had to drum up a huge PR campaign that was almost relentless, featuring these colourful characters. One called Poco, the pink elephant, because nothing says postcodes like a massive pink elephant.
No, it makes me think of postcodes.
Cajoling people into using them. Eventually, people started to put them on, and now you just can't imagine writing a letter without. I mean, SatNav is entirely based on postcodes these days. It's crazy.
Normally, postcode is the first thing you write in a lot of when you're ordering online. You type in the postcode, and you just pick your house number.
Because just think how confusing it was before then. Like, oh, I live on number 2 King Street. How many King Streets are there in the UK? It's mental. How many King Streets are there in London?
There used to be a postcode in Twickenham, which sadly got retired, I believe. And it was because it was something like, off the top of my head, TW1 1AT, which written down looks a bit rude. Moving on. So in 1961, the General Post Office was changed from a government department to a statutory corporation, meaning that the office of Postmaster General was abolished and replaced with the positions of chairman and chief executive in the new company. In 1968, the two-class postal system was introduced, using first-class and second-class services. Again, another world first. I wasn't aware that was such a recent thing. First class and second class.
It's if the English can find a way to divvy up things by class, they will.
Oh yeah,
it's just a way of getting more money, isn't it?
Weirdly, the phone service was also post office run until 1981, starting in 1912. Phones were in hotels and public buildings before progressing to the street in the 1920s. The one we are most familiar with is the K6, designed and introduced in 1935 under George V. British Telecom was eventually separated from the Post Office Corporation in 1980 and demerged as an independent business in 1981. In 1986, the Post Office was organised into 3 separate businesses: Royal Mail Letters, Parcels and Counters. The parcels business forms the foundation of Parcelforce. Further changes came under the Labour government of the late 90s and early 2000s with the Postal Services Act 2000, where the post office became a public limited company. The company was infamously renamed Consignia in 2001. I actually remember this being in the news. It was not a popular change.
Well, it was so unpopular that they had to basically rebrand. It's a bit like New Coke. They just had to quietly phase it out and return to the original.
Yeah, it's weird though, isn't it? Royal Mail, post offices, they're such sort of iconic brands, and Consignia is not. A few years later, in January 2006, the Royal Mail eventually lost its 350-year monopoly, and the British postal market was opened fully to competition. The competitors were allowed to collect and sort mail, and also pass it on to Royal Mail for delivery. This has led to online postage, allowing the general public to pay for and print their own stamps without having to visit a post office.
Yeah, and this is basically, we're coming to the end of the Royal Mail as a state-owned company now as we know it, because the privatisation of Royal Mail almost began immediately after the Conservatives got into power, alongside their Liberal Democrat buddies. The same year, interestingly, the Royal Mail got its first ever CEO, who was a woman, and that was Moya Green. Following the Postal Services Act of 2011, a majority of shares in Royal Mail were then put on the stock exchange, although that didn't actually happen until 2013. And the UK government initially retained a 30% stake, meaning it was still partly publicly owned. But in 2015, it sold all of its remaining shares, meaning it's entirely privately owned, ending 499 years of state ownership.
Yeah, so while Royal Mail does continue in name as a private corporation, sort of the end of it as sort of the National Postal Service of Britain.
So in that 500-year history, it initially started out as something for the king, then moved to the public, then became a completely state-owned thing, then became the centre of it was the heart of many communities, and gradually, in the space of a few decades, was just sold off.
I mean, there are arguments both ways, aren't they? Whether it should have been carved up and sold off. Times are changing.
Since Royal Mail was privatised, they've dished out 1.9 billion in profits to shareholders, which is incredible considering that Royal Mail posties have been on strike over poor pay. And it's the same with a lot of things we privatised. The water companies we privatised in the 80s, and they were privatised because they were massively in debt, they were underfunded, so we thought, let the private sector take care of them. And now they're in a worse state, they're in massive amount of debt, but they're still paying out billions to shareholders.
I mean, somewhere down the middle, probably some things have, I expect, been a success, privatised, and some things have been an abject failure. I mean, I think about the railways and the state they're in.
But they are privatised.
They are privatised. And it hasn't worked very well. I don't know.
Yeah, give me one good example of privatisation.
I haven't got one. I was going to say Rover, and then I remembered that failed. Okay, yeah, move on.
So that is a very brief roundup of one of Britain's most iconic and long-lasting national institutions, which is sadly probably in its death throes.
Yeah, well, that's a nice note to end on, isn't it?
Right, well, that was, as you said, a jolly ending. This is actually the part where we usually talk about an interesting fact or myth, but owing to audience feedback, we have had a slight retooling. This is exciting. It's going to be a quiz. Yeah, so every episode we will test each other on the respective topic that we talked about.
Right, it's getting very Radio 4, isn't it?
It's very Radio 4. I mean, who doesn't love a quiz? And as I said, I prepared some special sound effects. And I don't think I'm going to have to use this much, but I have a ping sound for every correct answer you get.
I like it, yeah. Good, okay.
Yeah, and then a classic...
Not so keen on that one.
I'm very much of the opinion, if you don't learn something by the end of the quiz, it's a failure as a quiz.
Right. Okay.
Obviously, my quiz nights aren't as packed as they used to be.
No.
No, don't worry. It's going to be fun, but hopefully you will also learn something. Although I did once ask a quiz question. I said, what famous 90s movie is about a young boy befriending a dolphin?
Flipper?
It's actually Free Willy, is the answer I was looking for.
Is it?
Killer Whales or Dolphins? I made so many people upset with that question.
You sound unbearable.
Anyway, here is the first of what I hope is many interesting quizzes. Don't worry, there's only 5 questions. And I'll also put a tension bed on. And don't worry, they're multiple choice. I should add that as well. So you've got a choice. I'm not just going to leave you on a limb. Question 1. What is Postman Pat's surname? Is it A, Stewart, B, Clifton, or C, Mailer?
I would love it to be Stuart, but I think it's Clifton. Okay, I get the good noise. Right.
Yeah. I didn't expect you to hear that at all, so you're already winning in my eyes.
You underestimated my Postman Pat knowledge.
Yeah, I did, yes. But you just took a punt. Let's be honest, you didn't know. Question 2. Whose postcode is XM4 5HQ? Is it A, the Queen, B, Danger Mouse, or C, Father Christmas?
Well, Father Christmas, from what I understand, does not live in the UK, and Danger Mouse lived in a dustbin. So I think the Queen...
He lived in a postbox.
Did he live in a postbox?
He lived in a postbox.
Why don't I living in a dustbin?
You're thinking about Oscar from Sesame Street.
I might be. I think the Queen's quite important. She probably has her own postcode.
She does have her own postcode, but it's actually Father Christmas's postcode.
Is he?
Yeah. XM4 Christmas. XM4.
Oh.
Question 3. Reginald Bray, who lived in the early 20th century, died in 1939, made it a lifelong habit of sending unusual things through the post. These include a postcard made of shirt cuffs, a rabbit skull, and frying pan. But what didn't he send in the mail? A. A turnip. B. His underwear. Or C. Himself.
I think it's the turnip. It get bashed around. It's not going to survive the post, is it? Oh.
No, it's his underwear. He did try and send a turnip, and he did try and post himself. Bray conducted a lifelong campaign of sending unusual items, and he would often actually send just things without addresses, but just print a photograph on the front cover and say it's there.
Oh.
Question 4. Which book caused such a stir upon release that the post office obtained a warrant to open any suspected packages containing it in 1933? Was that A. Mein Kampf, B. Lady Chatterley's Lover, or C. Ulysses?
I can't remember when Lady Chatterley's Lover came out, but I know it was controversial. 1930 sounds about right for Mein Kampf, though. I'm going to go with Mein Kampf.
It's actually Ulysses, which was banned for a very long time. Yeah, poor old James Joyce. And finally, I can't remember how many you've got right. I think you've got 1 so far.
1. I've got 1. Let's not rub it in.
I'm not looking forward to the next episode. Question 5 is easy, though, because we did talk about this in a previous episode. When did the world's first Christmas card go on sale?
Oh, that was...
So, was it A, 1842, B, 1843, or C, 1844?
Okay, I think I see what you did there.
Yeah, just trying to help.
1842.
1 year out, although considering the choices, you were quite you were close. You were close. It was 1843.
1843.
Right. Well, you've scored 1 out of 5. Well done.
A respectable 1 out of 5.
There is no prize for that level of score.
No.
If you had gotten at least 3, I would have mailed you like a Madeline or something.
Yeah. Well,
or one of your dorsal balls, whatever they were called.
I've done better with this one than I do with Only Connect, at least. That's the end of this episode.
All wrapped up like a neat little package.
Exactly. 500 years of history, there's a lot to cover. We didn't cover the BT Tower either.
Well, we just have.
There we go. BT Tower, tick that one off. Anyway, thank you for listening. Do please remember to subscribe. We're in all the usual places. You can also email us at info@thegallimaufry.show. If you have any feedback or questions or complaints, or you'd like to see Nick's saucy postcard collection, I'm sure he'd be willing to share it with you.
I could upload it to our Instagram. I could share some of my best postcards.
Well, then I think all that's left is to leave you with the clue for the next episode.
In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti.